Hello, this video is about Biographia Literaria by St. Coleridge, who in many ways appreciates and criticizes the Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballad, apart from giving his opinion on various literary aspects of poem and poem writing. Coleridge brings his opinion from his personal experience and philosophy, which is also a part of his life's journey. So let's understand it fully. Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge was published in 1817. It is autobiographical in nature and discusses Coleridge's sense of the stages that a poet goes through during their lifetime, though not in chronological order. In this essay, he gives importance to simplicity than any ornamentations in works. He says that the simplicity of expression in his earlier works was inspired by the Greek poets, and that even though he wasn't mature enough to fully comprehend the abstract and metaphysical topics that he chose to write on, his judgment in choosing the right subject matter was something that he is proud of. Also, in the beginning of the essay, Coleridge reminiscences about his days in secondary school at Christ's Hospital. His poem Frost at Midnight recollects his experiences with formal education, which he believes were detrimental to his naturally curious spirit. He opines that true learning can be outside classroom. Coleridge would rather allow children to roam free and absorb knowledge than force them to learn it through books in classroom. Then he takes a turn into his philosophy, which was influenced by German philosophers. Therefore, he proceeds to discuss how the mind perceives reality. Initially, he chooses to agree with David Hartley that new thoughts are necessarily born out of existing ideas. However, in time, he moves away from this concept and posits that new realities emerge as people interact with nature. He asserts that human minds do not operate mechanically and are not dependent on an input of old thoughts for newer ideas to appear. Coleridge considers the universe as a whole and feels that humans have the ability to perceive it as spiritual unity. He considers the ability to do so as the pinnacle of the perception. It is difficult to achieve, hindered by associative functions of the mind that pull the senses outwards to objects that are fancy, but which ultimately distract from the true pursuit of greater spiritual knowledge and understanding. Later on, he launches a discussion of Wordsworth's poetry. Coleridge takes Wordsworth at face value and applies to Wordsworth's poetry what Wordsworth in his 1800 preface to the Lyrical Ballads claimed to do. Coleridge shows that Wordsworth's protestations that his craft was the common language of common people was not strictly true, and that his poetry is nonetheless artifice, consciously crafted, and not the unreflective, thoughtless speech. Still, Coleridge argues that the Wordsworth is the finest contemporary poet and an example of poetic genius. He also gives his version of the origin of lyrical ballads of the 1798, saying that the Wordsworth was to write of natural scenes made extraordinary by his craft, while Coleridge was to write of the supernatural rendered credible by his art. During his discussion, he switched over to his philosophy on imagination for a while. He proffers his definition of imagination. He distinguishes the primary, which he describes as the divine ability to create, the source of all animate power. The secondary imagination is the human ability to create through the inventive perception and recollection of images. Last is the fancy, which is simply the ability to remember. Artistic influences. He also talked about Alexander Pope as a poet. He says that this passage gives a sense of the sweeping change in taste and aesthetic values that had occurred in poetry in the years since Pope was the dominant figure in English literature. Coleridge's evaluation is that the subject matter of the Pope verse was basically not appropriate for poetry. In this, Coleridge is restating with a slightly different emphasis a central point of his friend Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads from nearly 20 years earlier. It is perhaps the most important factor in the development of the artistic sensibilities of Romantic generation. Coleridge is concerned throughout the Biographia Literaria with exploring the relationship between the circumstances and the events of his own life on one hand, and on the other hand, his poetry and its reception by the public. His sense of the latter is that it has been largely negative, and a major theme of his work seems to be his attempt to account for this. Further, he adds that an important point is that the negative reception of Wordsworth was due not so much to Wordsworth's poems but to their interpretation in the light of lyrical ballads preface. Critics, Coleridge indicates, have reacted negatively to Wordsworth's critical principles expressed in the preface and have then transferred their dislikes of Wordsworth's aesthetics to his poetry. Coleridge's own point, the central message or theme of this section of his book, concerns the subjectivity and unreliability of such critical evaluation. Coleridge also expressed his critical opinions regarding what sort of language is appropriate for poetic expression. Wordsworth had famously indicated that his words and phrases, used only in poetry and not in prose or ordinary speeches, is actually unpoetic. Coleridge takes up issue with Wordsworth's evaluation. Coleridge's point is important for himself and his contemporaries and serves as a basic principle of aesthetic for poetry of all periods. That he would disagree with Wordsworth on this point is evident from Coleridge's own poetry and with his own idiosyncratic diction that distances it from prose and prose writing from speech. Individual expression despite Coleridge's disagreement with specific point in Wordsworth's aesthetics. The Biographia Literaria is something of prose analogue to Wordsworth's The Prelude. Both works are a record of the development of poet's mind and are a celebration of poet's personality and individualism. Ultimately, Biographia can be seen as a kind of fantasia of creative mind and thus a celebration of an artist's personal vision and his individuality as a creative person. Rather than seeking out the critical praise or understanding, Coleridge advocates for mental, spiritual, linguistic exploration on the part of the poet. William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, the poet, dramatist, is often regarded as the greatest author in English language. His fame was already secured during the late 18th century, when Coleridge was growing up. Coleridge says that Shakespeare's mastery on the language was such that each word not only has meaning but is also perfectly placed in sentence. Coleridge mentions that the evenness and sweetness of Shakespeare's demeanor and says that it is common trait of men of genius. William Wordsworth. Wordsworth is considered one of the pioneers of the Romantic age in English writing. The other being is Coleridge. Lyrical Ballads, jointly published by Wordsworth and Coleridge, remains one of the most influential publications in the history of literature. Coleridge was 24-year-old when he first met Wordsworth, and he recalls the meeting with great fondness, as it was during his interaction he learned of Wordsworth's mastery of the language. William Wordsworth was the poet laureate of Britain from 1843 to 1850. René Descartes. René Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician. Descartes developed a theory of rationalism and contributions to the field of analytical geometry. Coleridge was impressed by Descartes' idea, especially those that treat the soul as intelligence and the body as a matter. In Descartes' book, Discourses on the Matter, he introduces one of the most well-known philosophical assertions, I think, therefore I am. Summing up his essay, we can add that he extensively quotes Latin and Greek works in original languages. Though he does not present a systematic literary or philosophical theory of his own, he draws important conclusions about aesthetics, which have become a central part of literary theory and indirectly literary practice in the 200 years since Biographia Literaria was published. Another major concern of the work is the language appropriate to poetry. And on this point, Coleridge takes issue with friend Wordsworth. Though he and Wordsworth had collaborated on lyrical ballads nearly 20 years earlier, Coleridge does not fully agree with Wordsworth's condemnations of poetic diction and his dictum that such spatial words usage should be excluded from poetry. It is not only Coleridge's self-portrait but also an attempt to paint a picture of modern mind of the collective psyche dominant in the Western civilization over the past 2 centuries. Thanks for listening.